So we've got a great guest here in George Hoyem. He's the Vice President of Investments at In-Q-Tel. Long time at In-Q-Tel. Who hasn't heard of In-Q-Tel? Okay, well, you haven't. Okay, good. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, right? Oh, you have? Well, I can tell you a little bit about it anyways. But it's a not-for-profit VC firm that accelerates the development and delivery of cutting-edge tech to the IC and USG. But In-Q-Tel was doing national security investing before it was cool. I mean, it's all the rage now with all the various defense tech and national security tech firms. But they go way back. They famous companies they got behind. Anyone heard of Palantir? More recently, Anderol, GitHub, Rocket Lab, and a lot of them you haven't heard of because as soon as they invest in a company, certain countries start to take notice. So they're behind even more than you've even heard about. So why is this important? I mentioned this a little bit when we did some framing remarks a couple weeks back at the first meeting. The technology that we're going to need to prevail in this century's competition, it's not coming out of government labs or big primes or anywhere else. It's coming out of the commercial sector. And we have to find ways to get behind that technology early and develop it and deploy it at speed and scale. And that's exactly what In-Q-Tel has done, with great success and continues with great success thanks to George and the other members of his leadership team. But George comes up, he's got a lot of VC experience. He was most recently the managing partner at Blueprint Ventures. He was the general manager of HP's Internet Commerce Division. We share something in common. We were both junior high school yearbook photographers. So that's the way to greatness. He has a great website. What's it called again?
Hoyem.com.
Hoyem.com. There's a whole different side of George if you log on and you'll see
the soft side.
But In-Q-Tel's on fire. It's international. UK, Singapore. You told me some way.
Sydney.
It's a great company, and shameless plug for all of you if you want to consider going down that path. You're here at the right place. But George, thanks for all you're doing for all of us in this critical role, and thanks for joining us here tonight.
Well, thanks for having me.
Perfect. So George, thanks again for joining us here today. Maybe we can kick off with. So Joe gave a great introduction of what is In-Q-Tel, but what is In-Q-Tel to you? Like, how do you really kind of define the organization?
Yeah, so first off, we have internships every summer, so if anybody's interested in that, hit us up afterwards. But In-Q-Tel, I think of it as it's the venture capital arm of the U.S. intelligence community is the way to think about us. Mm-hmm. We were created by the CIA 20 years ago, and the mission was pretty simple. It was to source innovation from the startup community back in the dot-com era, and then guide those technologies into problems of national intelligence. And we do it in a pretty novel way. We have sort of two kinds of investments. We do equity-only investments to get involved in the company. But more importantly, we do these adaptation projects where we get a commitment from an end user in one of the agencies we serve. And we make an investment and guide those technologies and adapt them appropriately into pilots at scale. Mm-hmm. And so 75% of our deals are piloted against real problems. Mm-hmm. And about half of them are adopted, which is how we win, by the company and the customer conducting business directly. And we support now, we've moved way beyond the CIA. We now support 11 intelligence directorates, mm-hmm. NSA, FBI, DHS, DIA, etc. I can explain all these acronyms if you really want to know.
So how did you join In-Q-Tel, and what sparked the interest of working at the intersection of technology and national security?
So I've been a tech guy my whole career. In fact, I was saying to Steve Blank, we know each other. I'm afraid to say how long ago we met each other, but
Steve taught me about entrepreneurship when I was an
he was the original entrepreneur.
Yeah.
But I've been in the tech business for a long time, and I got into the venture capital business because I was always a creator of things inside big companies, and I decided one day after I helped sell Hewlett Packard, this company called Verifone, who make the payment devices. And I'm hanging out at HP, and I thought, and I did a venture capital-backed startup earlier in my career. I said, I want to become a venture capitalist. And people said to me, you don't know anything about venture capital. I was like, well, I raised money before. And I was very dogged about it, and I convinced, this is in the run-up to the dot-com era, and I convinced a company, a venture capital firm, to hire me as a venture partner. Took a cut in pay and, dug in there and tried to transition into the business, and here I am. I backed a company from my own venture firm that specialized in corporate spin-outs. That was our niche. We raised $200 million, and we were doing that. And there was a CEO of this company called Sarvega. His name was Chris Darby. Mm-hmm. And there was another investor, his name was Steve Bauscher, who became the number 1 and 2 at In-Q-Tel. And a couple years later, Chris approached me and said, hey, why don't you give back a little bit to us and come help us in the Valley, drive our brand. And I'm more of an outward-focused part of the team. And the rest of them are kind of a little more inward focused at that time. And so they convinced me to jump over. I have to admit, I didn't know anything about the CIA. It was kind of a scary thing. It was like CIA. Well, I'd done a deal with In-Q-Tel before, but when I went back to DC and understood what they did, the depth of reach that they had, and the ability as an individual to make an impact, I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. So I did that almost 15 years ago, and I never thought I would be here this long. But it's just an interesting job that it just has kept me here year after year, and I continue to love what we do.
So you lead the investment team at In-Q-Tel. You've been doing so for the past several years. How does the investment team sit within the In-Q-Tel organization? Maybe can you share a little bit more about that? How large is the investment team? Just a little bit more context.
Sure. So think of In-Q-Tel more like a strategic investment firm. We're like maybe our cousins are corporate venture capital firms. So unlike financial investors, we like to make money, but we're driven by strategic intent, not just making money. But the most strategic impact we have, by the way, are with the companies that we make the most money, ironically, or maybe not so ironically. So we're set up we're much larger than the average financial firm, meaning the sort of resources that we have. So our model is to actually, do these deals, but more importantly, have a programmatic function where we actually, to this earlier comment, we actually adapt and drive these projects into pilots. So when you think about In-Q-Tel, we start off with the investment team. It's about 25 to 30 of us if you add our international team. And so we're focused more generally into these 4 areas that I can explain later, 5 areas actually. And then we get paired up with a very deep technical bench. We have like 40 subject matter experts. These are PhDs of quantum computing or RF antennas or biotechnology. And so people like myself are more generalists, and we have focus areas, but we get paired up with a very deep bench of technical experts. The technical experts are crawling around our partners in DC. So those are the people that do deals. Our investment team hooks up with our tech team with the signal from the customer, and we go out and do deals and figure things out. Once we close a transaction, we had a program management function. So we have a program management team that's probably 20, 25 people, and they do the programmatic part of our mission. And this is something most VCs, in fact, almost all VCs don't even have. So we actually manage these projects, we convene the customers, we're like a design partner on steroids. And then we also have a systems engineering team that's probably 10 or 15 people. And these guys test the deliverables, because what do startups products do when you give them to companies? They blow out or they don't work. And so we actually test these deliverables to make sure that they meet the contractual commitments and they actually work before we hand them off to our customers to evaluate and run a pilot. And then we have lawyers and accountants and all the other stuff you have. So if you add In-Q-Tel up with all these programmatic functions, it's probably 180 people. But the investment team is sort of those big. It's the investment, program management, the tech team, the systems engineering team, and then what you call operations.
So you alluded to these focus areas. Maybe can you dive more into what are the focus areas?
Yeah, so they change a little bit depending on the canvas of investing. Right now we have a cybersecurity practice, and we're super active, and it's evolving into things like deepfake detection, for example, and synthetic news, all that stuff. Then we have a practice, we call it AI enablement. And so it used to be called enterprise tech, but now AI is the hottest thing. So everybody wants to put a generative AI model on a classified network to get the bad guys and figure stuff out. And we can talk about that. But all the things related to an enterprise or the AI enablement inside our partners is a big, gigantic wave. Then we have a group called intelligent connectivity. And this is a lot of the James Bond stuff. Sensors, antennas, power supplies, microphones, space tech, compute, high performance, AI semiconductors, for example. And then we have one called advanced systems. That's a little bit of a different cut on that, and could include networking, quantum, and just sort of more of the technologies that are hard tech. And then we also have a biotechnology area. And people are like, why are you investing in biotech? Well, most of the things we do originally were around things like, spy tech, like, hey, I want to get a piece of DNA and have it last a long time before I can take it somewhere and sequence it or stuff like that. But now it's moved into things like synthetic biology and understanding greater power competition, what China's doing in this area. And the sort of waves that are happening in the synthetic biology area are very transformative, and we're actively investing in that area.
Yeah, and then you talked a little bit about equity versus adaptation sort of investments. Maybe you can share a couple examples of both equity versus adaptation specifically within those focus areas.
So we often start out with an equity investment because, we are fast by government comparisons, but we're not as fast as the venture capital community.
Sometimes deals get done in 48 hours.
Right.
Here.
And we don't often move that quick. But we're much faster than government, thank God. So a lot of times we'll be doing an investment in an area and the government's like, holy cow, I don't even know how to think about that. But we know where it's going to trend. And so we want to get involved in the company early to put a spotlight on it. We also sometimes want to get involved in something because if something gets really big and successful, we're a distraction. But if we get in early, we can actually have influence and help shape the product for our partner base. So we're usually seed, Series A, and Series B kinds of investors. And it's important for us to get involved early before we get one of these adaptations pilots baked up, because they're much more complicated. They could also involve multiple agencies at the same time. We have deals where we get 2, 3, 4, or 5 agencies in the same transaction. So the equity only starts there, and a huge percentage of those in our certainly North America business will convert to one of these adaptation projects. So think of it as the farm team. And so that's the kind of the way we look at it. So of our equity only investments, almost 60% of them convert into these adaptation projects that are potentially more impactful.
And can you give us a sense of numbers here in terms of every year, how many equity, how many?
Yeah, so we're trending at about 75 investments a year. We're on our global canvas. Our international canvas is 10 to 15 deals outside the U.S. In the United States, probably 30 of them are these equity-only things, and about 30 of them are these adaptation projects. And over the years, and you think about that kind of accumulates. And the unique distinction of InQTel versus our friends down at DIU, we go really early. We're very involved in the company. We take a board seat in every deal we do. Because if you're not in the boardroom, it's more like a buy-sell relationship. I mean, it's very difficult to have understanding of what's broken, what's working, what's not, and to actually have the influence to create a more desirable outcome.
Maybe we could talk about investments like Anderol. Maybe we could talk about that, or GitLab as well. Can you share a little bit more about how that investment came about and also what the collaboration has been post-investment?
Yeah, I think Anderol, how many of you have heard of Anderol in the crowd? Okay. So Anderol, it was Trey Stevens and, Peter Thiel over at Founders, and they approached us with an idea. They said, we want to make a new age integrator. We think the integrators that are here today are kind of old, stodgy, not very quick. And we also want to take advantage. This is during the time when the border wall was being built and there was a lot of money sloshing around Washington. And they said, we have this idea of attacking, this problem from the border first, but we don't know where to start. And so we were in their seed round, and we walked them into their first customer, Customs and Border Patrol. We took Anderol in, we pitched them on the idea with Anderol, and they came up with an idea on how to help them, with this border construction. And this was a very lucky time for them because there was massive money being deployed to build the wall. And they took advantage of that, and they nailed some gigantic early contracts. And now they've expanded from there, and we've been a good partner along the way. We then followed that. We did an early equity-only deal, and then we followed up with, I think, 2 or 3 follow-on adaptation projects, and now they're being used inside 4 or 5 of our agencies. So, are we super involved with them now? No, because they've graduated, and they're very capable of doing their own thing. But in the early days, if you talk to anybody over there, say InQTel, A, delivered their first customer, and B, was very impactful to helping them understand the product market fit.
And what about something like GitLab?
So GitLab is another interesting, how many of you know GitLab? So it was coming along at the time. GitHub, which was the sort of commercial version of it, was very popular. It's a code repository management, CI/CD thing now. Continuous integration, continuous development is what that stands for. So at the time, they were leveraging an open source version of a Git. And a lot of people thought, well, why would you do that? Because GitHub is dominating the market. We saw an opportunity for an on-prem version of GitHub or Git that would have the sort of features necessary because the government manages gigantic projects that are software collaboration. And they wouldn't work with GitHub, which was like a web-based thing. And it wasn't open source, by the way. So we engaged with them. They had never done business with the government, but they had a really killer open source product. So I took the CEO of GitLab, I took him out to NSA, and I announced to the NSA team, I said, hey, we're bringing the CEO of GitLab in, and we want to kind of do a deal on this and that. So we walk into a room, and about 10 guys walk in with GitLab t-shirts. And they're like, oh, I guess you've heard of the company. And so they said, well, what are you guys doing? And he said, well, we've got 26,000 copies of GitLab running. And the company didn't even know because they were using the open source product. But there was all this other stuff they were doing around CI/CD, and we said, well, what if we adapted the product, built the right security features, helped you get the things that you need to work across the whole premium product suite? And they doing zero business with the government. So a couple years, well, we did this adaptation project. We gave them this like one feature, for example, like to mirror, data repositories between the classified network and the what they call the low network, was just stuff like that. And so all of a sudden, the fort was using it. They tried we put that premium product across the whole enterprise. And then fast forward 4 years later, they did like 8-figure transaction deals and dominated and took over the government and really almost wiped out GitHub. And we did that because we walked them into the right place and helped them understand what to build. And they went public shortly after that. We turned our little investment there into a lot of money.
So we talked about GitLab as really a dual use company, and then also Anderol, which is really more defense, government facing.
Yep.
Can you share your thoughts in terms of really, I think we've talked a lot about in prior conversations, dual use being perhaps more promising than just defense facing, but would love to.
Yeah, so there's, those of us who've been around a while, Steve and Joe would know this, like we see these multiple waves and these bubbles form, and we're in kind of one of those bubbles in the defense tech area, in my opinion, because there were some really outsized returns with Anderol. SpaceX is a good example of a defense-first company, Palantir, of course. And so that's driven a lot of venture capital into the sector. And there are some defense-first companies, and there will be some, but the problem is they're very few and far between. And the outsized venture returns that you would want to see from those kinds of companies, doesn't happen very often. But there's a lot of money coming in. So we continue to believe that the primary focus and opportunity is dual use, where you have a commercially successful company like GitLab, and you find a dual use into the federal government, but you draft and leverage their commercial success and make sure that you don't make it so far off the reservation that they have to constantly tweak it. And so I believe dual use is here to stay. We see with the Ukraine conflict going on, the advent and use of drones and other technologies, wireless, non-network comms, et cetera, like huge movement to use commercial tech against these military and defense use cases. But I still believe the sweet spot and the opportunity is more dual use, not defense first.
Yeah. What are some characteristics you see in successful dual use founders?
An openness. Like there's this myth that the Silicon Valley or the tech sector doesn't want to work with the government, and that's, in my experience, there are some exceptions, like consumer-facing stuff maybe, but the vast majority of people who have started, they're trying to cross the chasm, as we all know, and they're trying to get to their first product market fit and customer. So, they have to have an openness and willingness to think about things creatively. They have to be willing to make an investment in something that's got a longer horizon. Even through In-Q-Tel, it'll take a year or two or three to nail it. So you got to have a little bit of a longer horizon. But we have lots of examples of transactions going from 0 to 7 or 8 figure partners. And the venture capital community is paying attention. So why can we get into mostly every deal? Because they know if it works, it could be an outsized benefit to the company much earlier than they would find their way to the government. Most VCs will say, don't bother with the government, until you're much, much larger. And I would say the same thing as well without In-Q-Tel. I would say don't screw around with it. It's just too hard to figure. You'll be dead by the time you sell something to these characters.
Yeah. What advice do you have for the next generation of builders, innovators, founders who are interested in working at the intersection of technology innovation and national security? Work
with In-Q-Tel. I don't mean that in a prerogative. Like it is really hard to. These are very opaque places. Now the government writ large, commercial, it's like things in the state and local government and other civilian agencies, easier to get to, but they don't have as much money. But the defense and intelligence community has a lot of money, a lot of hard problems, and if you can find your way to those, and there are firms now like Andreessen Horowitz has a really great defense program, Lux Capital, Amplify. There's some people that have sort of figured it out, and they're very helpful. But you got to have a pathway in. It's very difficult to do on your own. You need a partner who understands that market.
So I think this might be a good time to bring up AJ over here. So AJ's been on the investment team at In-Q-Tel for 7 years.
Yeah.
7 years.
Yeah, time's going fast.
And
his hair was white when he started. It was red after he got it.
So AJ, maybe you could share a little bit more about what's your day-to-day like at In-Q-Tel?
Yeah, so I'm AJ Bertone, and I'm a managing partner. I work for George. He was talking about how our team is set up at kind of 2 different coasts for our investment team. We have a small office just up the street in Menlo Park, and that's the team that I lead. In terms of day-to-day, there's no 2 days are the same. Spend a lot of time in board meetings these days. Spend a lot of time with pipeline. We also spend a lot of time with our government partners. As I have kind of come up the ranks, I spend more time with the East Coast of our organization.
And a lot of time developing your people.
That too, yeah. So yeah, never a dull day. I would say honestly, majority of my time now is with portfolio companies and with the internal team. I'm doing a little bit less on the new deal front, but yeah, hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavor for it.
And I think you're also working on the DIU collaboration, and George, of course, alluded to DIU Defense Innovation Unit down the street in Moffett Field. Can you share more about how In-Q-Tel is differentiated within the innovation ecosystem from other partners like DIU?
Yes, in a prior life, I served on active duty in the Army for 7 years, and I think when I showed up to In-Q-Tel, people were like, "Oh, Army guy understands DoD, so why don't you go off and figure out this DIUX thing?" At the time,
He understood more of the acronyms than I did.
That's true. Yeah. And yeah, I have kind of been our point person for DIU for the last several years at this point. Steve Boucher, our CEO, and Doug Beck, the current director of DIU, were just actually on stage at CFR a couple weeks ago and articulated, I think, a framing between the 2 organizations that really works well, where In-Q-Tel is the early stage. George talked a little bit about this, kind of identifying these really, really early stage opportunities that have potential and helping shepherd them and potentially adapt their product to what I call product mission fit. Essentially, some validation that this commercial product is useful against mission. And then if you liken this to a venture capital analogy, you have a later stage investor, or a growth stage investor, which is DIU, coming in to essentially scale that technology for what they call defense market penetration. So In-Q-Tel early stage, DIU growth stage. We're doing the early identification and adaptation, find product mission fit, and then DIU comes in to really scale it. Yeah.
Maybe question for both of you, best or favorite deal that you've worked on?
How much time do we have?
That would be for a bad deal or something like that?
You have never done a bad deal.
No, that's not true.
I would say it takes $20 million to train a venture capitalist. So
yeah, I don't know if I've spent that much yet. Best deal. Unfortunately, this is one that's not announced. So one challenging thing about In-Q-Tel is probably only 10% of the investments we make, maybe a little bit more now. 15%? What do you think, George? Something like that. Let's say 10 to 15% of the investments we make are publicly disclosed. It's not like it's secret or classified, but for reasons that relate to confidentiality for both our government partners and our portfolio companies, we typically don't make the relationship public. In this case, the example, I think my biggest winner is one that we have not publicly disclosed. It is a Stanford affiliated company, 4 co-founders from Stanford, and it's been an amazing journey. One of my first investments back in 2018. We started off very small with one government relationship. That one relationship grew to 5 relationships within the confines of the In-Q-Tel relationship. And then the company started to go out on its own. It started to build out its federal team. We were a part of that hiring. They started to secure contracts, 7-figure, 8-figure contracts. And now I'm still hanging around the hoop on the board as an observer, but the company, by and large, is really on its own. It's blossomed into a very, very large, public sector business. It's been extremely fulfilling, and most importantly, it's been very impactful to government. So, sorry I can't share the name.
It's always tough when you can't share, and then it means you just can't land on the Midas list either, since you don't share that data.
No, that's okay.
So, George, do you have a best or favorite?
Well, I think the GitLab is one of it's public examples. I have another one like AJ that came, it's not announced, but it came out of University of Michigan, and it's we were really involved very early to help shape the product, and they're just crushing it right now. These things will become more visible later. On the what is your worst deal side, most of the times when it doesn't work is when you have, founders, it's all about the product market fit, and you have to be open to the journey of pivoting and finding your way. But founders who don't listen to the marketplace are usually the most acute failures, because they think they know the answer, they know what the customers really want. But in the end of the day, we have to follow the money and follow the customer demand. So lots of examples of companies that didn't make it because of arrogance of the founder or lack of willingness to listen to the market signals. And occasionally you just whiff, because one of my most spectacular failures, this is not at In-Q-Tel, but I invested in a company this is back in the days of internet peering, Steve may remember these days, but like bandwidth was really expensive, and it was like, wow, if we can make this less expensive, we'll make a lot of money. And we went and we invested in this company that could really reduce the cost of bearing bandwidth, like accessing internetworks. And the prices collapsed right after we did the deal. The thing went to zero, which reminds me of like today, large language models and Gen AI are using massive amounts of compute resources. And I guarantee you someone's going to figure out how to do that for an order of magnitude less money. And the people that are betting for the cost of compute there to be the same are going to get crushed probably. But that's the kind of thing you can get caught onto these market trends that are really macro trends that you can't fight. And sometimes your worst deals will happen in those macro trends.
AJ, do you have a worst deal or?
No, I have a couple that have gone to zero. It is a risk business at the end of the day. I mean, the government funds us to specifically find early stage companies knowing that they're risky. So we're not looking for 100% success. If we were to have that, we'd not be taking enough risk, right? We really are trying to go for the outsized outcome. So it's okay that there have been some failures. I would add to George's comment, if you're talking about why things fail on the founder's side, we also sometimes experience challenges on the government side. Champions in government often get promoted and go on to the next position. And now the person who potentially endorsed adaptation or had a use case for the technology is no longer there. So that can be very hard. We de-risk that by trying to bring more than one government agency to the table. George mentioned we're working with 11 or something like that. It changes a little bit every year. We're trying to build redundancy and where can we find commonality of the use case across our, intelligence community partners, so that if one were to leave or someone's going to get promoted, there's still opportunity there for the company. It also allows the government to get leverage out of its dollars. We can, do more with dollars from each partner. So that's another area where I've seen failures on the government side, turnover of personnel.
Why don't we open up for questions? Questions from, yes.
What's the difference between you guys and a phase 2 similar?
Sure. Okay.
That's
Want to
easy.
take that? Or?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, a phase 2 SBIR, as you know, is grant funding. It's non-dilutive funding. And I'm assuming you're kind of framing it within the AFWorks program. And SBIR is a small business administration grant that you could technically get from a lot of different entities, but most people refer to it within the construct of the AFWorks program. What I would say is when the SBIR program was initially created, the idea was not to facilitate what we call solution transfer, essentially bringing product to mission. It was more about increasing the Air Force's what they call the CTIB, the Commercial Technology Industrial Base, essentially the number of commercial entities that are doing business with the Air Force, lowering the bar for them to do business with the Air Force, basically bringing them in the front door. And because that was the initial vision, I think what we've seen over time is that their solution transfer rates have been very, very low because it's not really oriented around adapting technology for some mission application. So what is the biggest difference? I would say ultimately it relates to, is your technology going to be useful to mission? Now, granted, the SBIR program has been successful in terms of that CTIB objective, but it hasn't really transitioned many programs from phase 2 to phase 3, which is some direct contract that's not under the SBIR umbrella, or some larger program of record or something like that. Of course, there are exceptions, but that's my 2 cents and has been my impression after kind of tracking this for the last 5 years or so.
Why did CIA choose the VC model instead of just giving a grant?
So the thing that we do, and like you can see it with DIU in their early days, if you're not in the boardroom, and how do you buy your way into the boardroom? You buy it in through equity. And if you're not in the boardroom, again, back to this buy-sell relationship, you don't have the insights to help shape things, to understand where things are going to go wrong, to be a strategic partner at the table. And so the In-Q-Tel model is really, without being in the boardroom, it really wouldn't work. In fact, we get in the boardrooms of companies for a really tiny amount of money relative to our peer group. And it's because it's a price of entry. You want our help, we want to be a strategic partner. We're not interested in a buy-sell relationship. And so, CIA does lots of stuff where they, have SBIR's equivalents and they have CRADAs and they have research grants, but they don't really have the control over the model or the efficacy that we do. And for the amount of money we spend, the efficacy that we get, like we spend a tiny fraction of what DIU does, for example, and we would argue, very high impact potential. So it's unique. I don't think In-Q-Tel could get created today. It was created in a time of sort of bipartisan creation. We actually were created under a thing called Title VIII, which is a unique exception with the authorities to do what we do, to hold equity and sit in a boardroom. It's a very unique capability. No one else in the government has found their way to the authorities to do what we do yet. Even around the world, I think we're pretty unique.
And I'd love to hear thoughts from either of you on counterintelligence in Silicon Valley. In particular, it's no secret that there's U.S. competitors that spend a lot of funds and effort trying to collect national security secrets from early stage technology companies. How are you considering that challenge with your portfolio or your greater relationships in government?
Well, let me start by saying that, there's certain of our adversaries or our competition partners around the world. I think the Chinese, everybody knows, would acquiring intellectual property in a company is just another form of competition. And I have tried to I've backed a dozen companies that tried to enter the Chinese market, and every single one of them eventually pulled out because their stuff was reverse engineered or they were marginalized out of the business. And so it's something you have to be aware of. If you're a company and you want to do business in certain parts of the world, your IP is going to be attacked and going to be repurposed. And it's just it's just another form of competition. So you have to be aware of it. So we spend a lot of time coaching our companies on what they should expect, what they could do, and how to protect their IP and their markets and their intellectual property. It's just a reality of the way the world is right now.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I mentioned before, we don't disclose a lot of our investments. One of the reasons is because we don't want to make them, targets for a foreign intelligence service. This topic of FOCI, foreign ownership, control, and influence, is one that, that acronym now is here in Silicon Valley. Some people know what that is. It's becoming a part of the lexicon and people are talking about it more. We get questions from entrepreneurs around, hey, if I take this foreign capital, what are the impacts potentially to me? And we don't have, there's no black and white rule, and nor are we an authority. But back to our board observer positions, we can help advise companies and other board directors on the potential second and third order effects of those things. So it's definitely a topic that's in focus right now. And you're seeing some venture funds as well, very high, prominent tier one investors that are, forking off their Chinese subsidiaries or, other, parting ways with foreign entities because of this exactly. So it'll be interesting to see how it trends.
And we don't put any terms in any of our deals that you can't do this, that. We want to, the fear and greed of capitalism is a great moderator for the right thing to do. And so, people make their choices. We tell them what the implications are, and we don't get in the way.
There was another question.
Do you think there's an opportunity for a setup like In-Q-Tel for non-defense investments in the government?
Yeah, I do. In fact, we helped spawn, there's this BARDA.
GHIC, Global Health Investment Corporation.
Global Health Investment Corporation. It's a biotech-related fund. We coached and gave them the playbook and helped them get that going. And that's a good use in the biotech area. It's underneath the HHS, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. The UK created this thing called NCIS, NCIS. NCIF, thank you, NCIF. And we totally coached them up, handed them the playbook, showed them how to do it. And they have their own In-Q-Tel style thing in the UK that they're doing now, which is a testament to the model. So, I think there's a lot of opportunity. That comes back to the authorities, like where in the government, and particularly in a divided Congress and the sort of political environment we're in right now, where do you get the authorities to create something that can do what we do? And we were created at a time 25 years ago when there was less, first of all, people didn't understand what equity was, but there was less partisan, views on this stuff.
Hi. I'm from Ukraine. I have a few friends who are working on defense startups, and they're looking out for funding. So I'm curious, what's your view on investing into startups in defense space, like specifically in Ukraine, if you have any cases or examples? And the second question is about selling to Department of Defense here in the US. What are some of the specifics, specifically for those technologists and startups that established outside of the US?
Yeah, we have not invested in Ukraine.
Yeah,
we have presence in Europe. I think we're spending time there, but we have not made an investment yet. In terms of advice for selling to the U.S. government, I think the first thing, depending on what you're developing, you need to familiarize yourself with the various export control regimes, most likely something called ITAR. That's potentially, if you don't have the right licenses for selling and exporting technology, you could very quickly get hemmed up there. I don't know what else you'd add.
Yeah, I'd also say, we, as I said earlier, we often don't do defense first deals, like things that are kinetic, guns, missiles. That's just not our space, frankly. That's the land of systems integrators and defense contractors. And they're very niche-y things that often are cost plus kinds of models that don't fit the venture regime. So if there's something a venture capitalist would co-invest with us, that would be, but most of these defense types of technologies are really not what we do. We've done some drone stuff. We did Skydio, for example, which is now scaling. But
I would think the NSIF or NISIF, NSSIF is what it is. That might be more relevant, or also Diana or the NIF, the NATO Innovation Fund or Investment Fund. There's some things that are popping up or that have popped up in the last couple of years that are more closely, I think, or in your back door.
By the way, we have 30 of our portfolio companies actively being used and deployed in Ukraine right now. So we're helping from that side.
Go ahead.
Jumping on some of the theme of the previous question, as a nonprofit that's investing public money in confidentially, I'm curious about what are the sort of metrics of success that you define and track how these might be different from other VC firms, and ultimately sort of what and who keep that accountable?
Yeah, good question. On the first, like any strategic investor, including corporate VCs, by the way, they have the same challenge. We are very acute in measuring both quantitative and qualitative criteria, our KPIs. Our most important KPI is pilots against real problems and adoptions. And then we measure mission impact. And so those are a little bit of quantitative and qualitative. We do like to make money, and so we track our return on investment. Amazingly, our returns in our venture investing are top quartile, maybe top decile. And it's amazing because we get signal from the partners we work with and we help them succeed. So we measure success, basically pilots and adoptions are highest order, and then mission impact.
Yeah, and adoption, I typically describe to an entrepreneur as portfolio company technology making a positive impact on the national security community's mission, and as a result of that, the national security community making a positive impact on the company's income statement. That is, and George had referenced this before, that is what keeps the flywheel spinning, both sides of the equation getting value from it. The other thing quickly to add is proceeds come back to our balance sheet, but we plow them back into the business for incremental taxpayer benefits. So we're recycling dollars. All the equity investments we make are from our balance sheet, essentially proceeds from past investments. We're reducing the cost of the taxpayer over time.
We made a decision early on. Originally, we had a small venture fund that was venture economics, but we determined that that caused a lack of alignment between us and our partners. Because if someone at In-Q-Tel was getting rich on the backs of the taxpayers, that wouldn't be cool. So we pay our people very well, but we decided not to move to an incentive structure like carry. And so people that work at In-Q-Tel have to be into the mission. We pay very well. We pay kind of corporate venture kinds of compensation, but you'll never get rich at In-Q-Tel. And it's important for us to keep that construct so that we can have the right alignment with our partners.
Yeah. I think about a year ago, we had the Department of Defense Office of Strategic Capital come. And I guess I'm just curious how you see In-Q-Tel as doing something different, or how you're distinct from other intra-government VCs, and also whether you foresee a future in which there's sort of a diverse environment of competing intra-government venture capitalists. Is that something you think would be?
We have Eric here from OSC. He just left. You grab a mic and come up.
I will take a shot at that. You bet. And to be clear on that, I no longer work for OSC. I am not part of the government, but I was part of the team that stood that up. And one of the key differences essentially is the type of financial tool that's used. What we're talking about here are equity investments, sometimes contracts, but the Office of Strategic Capital relies primarily on debt-based tools like loans and loan guarantees. So you could imagine that a lot of component level technologies in particular need large amounts of debt-based financing for scaled production. You could think of creating facilities or anything that needs patient capital over the long term. And that would be a key difference, essentially in the financial instrument.
Yeah, I think that's right. At the end of the day, it's more, it's great that the government is doing everything it can to drive capital into technology areas that matter for national security. So In-Q-Tel actually has a small partnership with OSC now. It's very complementary to our model. And to your bigger picture point, yeah, again, it's great that the government's trying to pull out all stops to drive money where it matters the most. In-Q-Tel is just one part of it, right? There's no possible way our model could address it all. And it's great that the government's innovating with things like OSC and boosting DIU's budget as well on the procurement side. So really pulling out all the stops.
So maybe final question, now with this current great power competition, what is In-Q-Tel thinking about actively, especially as we've kind of moved on from a global war on terror?
So one of the interesting things that happened to us a couple of years ago, so we're moving towards potentially decoupling our economies, the East and the West. And we've seen all the supply chain challenges. And, part of it is that the East will not play on the same competitive rules as the West. Like you can't own controlling interest in companies for the most part, stuff like that. So we saw this happening years ago, and we're seeing, competition move from, kinetic forms of competition to intellectual property and supply chain and technology and, economics. And so what happened is the CIA actually reorganized a bunch of their assets inside their agency and created a thing called T2MC, which, you know what it stands for?
Technology and Transnational Mission Center.
Oh, there you go.
AJ's really good with acronyms.
Yeah, he's got the acronym boy. But technology becomes, because mission centers, they have mission centers that are set up for problem areas, like how you can go organize around a problem. And so they created one around technology. And they're saying, technology is now the new battleground. And so they looked around and they said, we've got this asset, In-Q-Tel, that has a global footprint and probably the deepest view of technology trends of anybody in the government. And now they're looking to us to help them understand what's going on with quantum computing, what's happening with semiconductor supply chains, what's happening with, new wireless technologies, non-terrestrial networks, space tech. And so they come to us and we can help give them guidance on how these things are breaking and where's, what papers are being published, where's the center of gravity around these things, and how do we factor that into our national security and defense strategies. And so we're more of a voice on both Capitol Hill and in the intelligence community to help inform policymakers of how these trends are breaking and how they should think about it from a technology perspective.
Mm-hmm. George, AJ, thank you both for joining us here today.
Of course.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
We've alluded to the great Steve Blank throughout this talk. And Steve, maybe you could share a couple of concluding thoughts.
Sure. Well, it's a real honor. Did you guys bring the bag of money for those folks in here? How many want to do startups in national security? Anybody in the room? So how many have done startups in national security? Is that why you're back in school? So I just want to give you some context of what you just heard. For those of you who know how normal venture capital and startups work, it's kind of an asymmetric information flow. That is, if you're a founder, you know a lot more than your VCs on a day-to-day basis. You know what's going on inside your company. You know about the customers you're calling on, et cetera. So to kind of, balance out that asymmetry, they take a board seat. They have not only equity in your company to make money, but the way they kind of hopefully keep track of what you're doing is like you have board meetings. And if they're good, and most of them are, at least at minimum, they have pattern recognition skills, they can actually help you at times with understanding how to go to market. If it's something as simple as B2C, they might understand the relative trends and when you have product market fit, et cetera. If it's as complicated as business-to-business sales, selling to the enterprise, they might remind you the heuristics about doing that there are multiple stops along product market fit of both users and then the buyers. But the biggest asymmetry is a startup trying to sell to the government. That is the most opaque set of organizations on the planet. And what In-Q-Tel brings is not only money and not only insight about the problem sets that they have, but most importantly for anybody in the room, what you just heard is they know how to actually go to market in a incredibly opaque segment of the government. And those are by the way, does anybody know how many intelligence communities there are inside the Department of Defense? Just inside the DoD. Anybody know the number? 12?
16, 18?
17.
In ODNI.
17. Yeah, and CIA, who's kind of separate for ODNI above. So there's at least, depending on how you count, 18 separate intelligence agencies just in the U.S. government. It doesn't count the things they do overseas. To have that type of insight inside a single startup from a founder is almost impossible. But you have it right here. And that is a huge value to any startup thinking about working with the U.S. government and the U.S. intelligence communities. The other part that I think you heard implicitly here is kind of the journey that In-Q-Tel has been on since its founding. Anybody know who started In-Q-Tel at all? Gilman Louis, right? Gilman Louis was a video game developer. If you've ever looked at ancient video games, I think he did F-16, was that the, right? But he had this vision of like, no, the CIA needs its own venture capital community. And in fact, his partner was a part of the MS&E department after he retired, Bill Perry, who was the ex-Secretary of Defense. And he had convinced Bill Perry that this was actually a creative idea because before Bill Perry became Secretary of Defense, he was the founder of a technology company in Silicon Valley. So that intersection always points to Stanford. So, George and AJ, I want to thank you for coming. It's been a heck of a journey and enormous value to not only the U.S. government, but to entrepreneurs and anybody thinking about a government startup. This should be your first stop in Silicon Valley. So thanks, guys.
Okay.
Thank you.